I didn't know he was going to pull the trigger. I didn't know when the picture was taken.
Have you ever seen an image of someone so terrible that nobody can look at the person the same way again? Everybody has their own bad moments, but there are some pictures out there in the world that were captured at the worst time imaginable.
In 1968, Peter Norman made a bold stand for racial equality.
From a man caught eating a sandwich in a fairly unpleasant manner to a comedian going too far with an explicit joke,
I didn't break the law. I didn't do anything wrong. That photo is very much covered by the First Amendment.
here are 13 photos that ruined people's lives forever. Number 13. Opilia's Tragedy. Suppose you were living in Victorian England when the air was full of smog, and life's tempo was much slower than today, but the social demands could oppress one's spirit. During this period, one artist, namely John Everett Millais, was said to have produced one of the most stunning and ethereal portraits ever painted. It is a picture of a young woman who is shown to be dead and drifting on the water of a riverbed with flowers around her. However, the model who posed for Opilia wasn't your ordinary lady. Her name was Elizabeth Siddal, and unlike models of today, Elizabeth was not born into fame or wealth. Indeed, she was just a young woman working in Victorian England as the assistant to a hat maker, struggling to survive in a society that paid little attention to someone of her status. However, God had different plans for her in the future. The beautiful woman with red hair and pale skin attracted the attention of artists of the pre-Raphaelite painters fraternity, which gave its members the freedom to create works that were detailed and colorful. She was quite beautiful and had a look that perfectly embodied whatever the artists wanted to portray. The life of a model in Victorian times was not as exciting as it is now. There were no glamour shots and no luxurious dressing rooms, just a small, comfortable space to get ready. However, Elizabeth was in situations that were compromising and sometimes lethal. This can be shown through the story of her work on Opilia. Millais wished to achieve the most accurate reproduction possible, and so made Elizabeth pose in a bathtub filled with water to resemble the river of the painting. It was winter at the time, and although Millais had arranged for oil lamps to keep the water warm, they were eventually extinguished, and Elizabeth found herself in ice-cold water. Feeling the discomfort of the position, Elizabeth did not budge an inch as the artist painted for hours. However, the price she paid for such devotion was high. The cold water eventually led to her developing pneumonia, a condition she had to endure throughout the rest of her life. Now remember, this was the 1800s, and treatments were often as likely to kill as they were to cure. In Elizabeth's case, the doctors prescribed her laudanum, which is a combination of alcohol and opium. It is a pity that while laudanum relieved her of pain, she also fell into a paralysis of opium addiction. Years later, she became ill, and the beautiful young woman who was the muse of some of the most famous artists of the time was left alone and helpless. Elizabeth's personal life was no less chaotic, and she had a rather disturbing relationship with another prominent artist of that period, Dante Gabriel Rossetti. The two were lovers, but not a very healthy kind of couple. In fact, they had a very rocky relationship. They got engaged and got married, but by this time, Elizabeth was very sick and had developed a drinking problem. She was unhappy in her marriage and had a stillborn child in 1862. It is widely known that she died of an overdose of laudanum, poisoning herself. However, the death of this woman did not bring the sorrow to an end. Suffocated by guilt and unbearable sorrow, Rossetti made a rather peculiar choice. In despair, he sealed a notebook of poems for Elizabeth and placed it with her in the coffin, but 7 years later, Rossetti regretted it. In a bid to reclaim the notebook as well as other works that he lost, he even dug up Elizabeth's grave. Elizabeth Siddal's life, once filled with promise, became a cautionary tale of how art and beauty can come at a devastating cost. However, some incidents are just too stupid to even sympathize with. Number 12. A political tragedy. Take Anthony Weiner, for instance. If there's one thing everyone should remember before they hit send on anything, it's the difference between a private message and blasting your business out to the whole world. Former New York Congressman Anthony Weiner learned this the hard way back in the early 2010s. He had a promising political career, had made some pretty powerful speeches, and people were even whispering about him being a future president. Everything looked pretty great for him until it all went south almost instantly. So, what happened? Well, one day, Weiner decided to send a private photo to a young woman. The photo wasn't of his smiling face or a scenic view. It was a picture of his boxer-clad private parts. It wasn't exactly the kind of image you wanted to end up on the internet. However, unfortunately for him, that's exactly what happened. Instead of sending it as a private message, he accidentally posted it publicly on Twitter. Within moments, his ill-advised selfie was out there for the entire world to see. Naturally, Weiner quickly realized his mistake and deleted the tweet, but it was too late. The damage was done. Conservative blogger Andrew Breitbart had already taken a screenshot, and from there, the story spread like wildfire. Media outlets, especially TMZ, dug up even more compromising photos, and before long, Weiner's political career was in ruins. He was forced to resign from Congress, and his once promising trajectory turned into a downward spiral. Things only got worse when he was later convicted of sending inappropriate messages to a teenager, sealing his fate as one of the most infamous political downfalls in recent history. While this was unfortunate, the next photograph will leave you wondering just how long consequences really last. Number 11. The end of a legacy. General Nguyen Ngoc Loan is a name you might not immediately recognize, but his actions during the Vietnam War were captured in one of the most iconic and disturbing photos of the era. Loan was photographed in the middle of the Tet Offensive, shooting a captured Viet Cong fighter in the head. The image shocked the world and instantly made Loan a symbol of cold-blooded violence. What many people don't know is that the Viet Cong fighter had just murdered the family of one of Loan's friends. In the chaos of war, Loan's actions, though brutal, were driven by a personal vendetta. But the photo told a different story, a story of a heartless execution. The image followed Loan for the rest of his life. When Saigon fell, Loan sought refuge in the United States, but immigration officials recognized him from the photo and tried to deport him. It took the intervention of the photographer, Eddie Adams, to stop the deportation, but the damage was done. Loan later opened a restaurant in Washington, D.C., but when the photo resurfaced, he was forced to close it down. Adams, reflecting on the impact of his photograph, once said that 2 people died in that photograph. The general killed the Viet Cong, and he killed the general with his camera. As you'll see in the next photo as well, being the good guy doesn't always pay off. Number 10, the grand disappointment. Meet George Holliday. He was just an ordinary guy living his life, working as a drain rooter. Things were pretty normal for Holliday until the night of March 3, 1991. That's when he heard the sound of sirens outside his home, a sound that would lead him to an event that would forever change his life. Curious about the commotion, Holliday grabbed his video camera and headed outside. What he captured on tape was something that would shake the nation to its core: the brutal beating of Rodney King by several police officers. This was long before the days of smartphones and social media, so the fact that Holliday managed to record the incident was nothing short of remarkable. Unfortunately, the footage he captured would become infamous, and instead of being a proud moment in his life, it turned into a nightmare. You see, back then, many people believed that the police could do whatever they wanted without fear of repercussions, especially when it came to dealing with marginalized communities. Even with clear video evidence showing officers mercilessly beating an almost unconscious man, the courts acquitted the officers of all charges. The verdict led to outrage across Los Angeles, leading to riots that resulted in 54 deaths, thousands of injuries, and widespread destruction throughout the city. While the world was struggling with the aftermath of the riots, Holliday found himself in an unexpected and unfortunate position. Despite being just a bystander with a camera, some people began to blame him for the riots, as if filming the truth was somehow responsible for the violence that followed. The media attention only made things worse for him. Once his identity became public, he started receiving death threats, and his life began to unravel. Holliday's personal and professional life suffered greatly. He lost his job, and the strain on his marriage proved too much to bear. Today, he continues to work as a freelance drain router, but he's had to keep a low profile, avoiding any sort of advertisement that might draw unwanted attention. To add insult to injury, even his small claim to fame, a trivia card in Trivial Pursuit, misspelled his name as Halliday. Still, we're yet to talk about the stupidest photo to end someone's career on this list. Number 9, the wrong way to eat a sandwich. Ed Miliband was the leader of Britain's Labour Party from 2010 to 2015. He was the guy who was supposed to take on Prime Minister David Cameron and win the election. At least, that's what the polls were saying, but after that came the bacon sandwich incident, and things went completely out of control. It all started innocently enough. Miliband was out in London, grabbing a quick bite in Covent Garden when a photographer snapped a picture of him eating a bacon sandwich. Sounds harmless, right? However, the photo captured Miliband in such an awkward, unflattering moment that it became a meme almost instantly. The image of him struggling with the sandwich, his face contorted in a way that just didn't scream future prime minister, stuck with the public. As the election drew closer, the image came back to haunt him. The tabloids had a field day with it, especially The Sun, which plastered it on their front page right before the general election. Any policies or plans Miliband had were completely overshadowed by the relentless stream of bacon jokes. The whole thing was so ridiculous, yet so impactful, that some commentators even suggested it cost him the election. This wasn't just any loss. It was a major defeat that changed the course of British politics. However, you'll be surprised just how deeply politics can affect almost every aspect of life, even sports. Number 8, the odd one out. You must have seen this picture at some point, but you may not know the whole story behind it. Yes, of course, it occurred during the Olympics, and the picture depicts the athletes on the medal stand. However, it is not just a story from the 1968 Mexico City Olympics. It involves two American runners, Tommy Smith and John Carlos, who went home with medals in the 200-meter finals. But the main turning point did not come from the fact that they won. It came from the stand that they took once they won. When they were on the awarding platform, with the entire world as their audience, they made what came to be called the Black Power gesture. This was not just an act of goodwill. It was a declaration that clearly earmarked their names in the history of the civil rights movement. However, while we concentrate on Smith and Carlos, there is another person in that picture. It's a man who looks somewhat lost, standing there and making a somewhat neutral face. That man was Peter Norman, an Australian athlete who took the silver medal that day. Peter Norman, who stands as if he has no idea how to properly use his hands, knew perfectly well what was about to happen. Earlier in the day, he had talked to Smith and Carlos, and he knew how big of a protest they were planning. Not only was Norman on their side, but he also played an active role in the efforts. It was Norman's suggestion that led to the black gloves they wore, and he himself put on a civil rights badge on his tracksuit when he moved to the podium. You would imagine that this kind of hero should be embraced by society, especially an athlete who is willing to show so much empathy. Unfortunately, that was not to be the case. In Australia at the time, the political climate was bad and unforgiving. The immigration policy dictated that only whites were allowed entry. The idea that Norman supported racial equality in public wasn't something that his homeland could accept. It was like Norman had dealt a blow to the stomach of the nation's status quo, and the response was immediate and unrelenting. Norman was one of the fastest men in the world, and he had achieved the second-best time in the entire globe. but he was to be barred from any subsequent Olympic trials. When the 1972 Munich Games came, Australia did not enter any sprinters for the 200-meter race, thus removing Norman from the Olympic stage. This was a massive professional setback, but it was a tragedy in a personal sense as well. After this, Norman faced a period of depression and alcoholism. The years went by, and by the time the 2000 Sydney Olympics came around, many expected that Norman would finally be awarded his dues. However, in a cruel irony, Norman was left out once again. He was one of the very few Australian Olympians who were not allowed to take the ceremonial lap of honor during the Games. It was a sign of how much his own country had shut him out and left him to face the world all by himself. That is why all of this happened, because Norman decided to be on the right side of history. Sometimes, though, even the good guys get mistaken for being bad. Number 7. A big misunderstanding. Imagine doing something good, something you believe is right, only to end up as an international villain. That's exactly what happened to Dick Middleton, a police officer in the American South during the Civil Rights era. You might have seen the infamous photo. Middleton, a white cop, appears to be letting his dog attack a young black protester. The image became a powerful symbol of racial brutality and was even turned into a statue in Birmingham. However, here's the thing. What you see in that photo is not the full story. Malcolm Gladwell explored Middleton's story in his podcast, Revisionist History. What actually happened that day was a lot more complicated. According to Gladwell, the young protester, Walter Gadsden, accidentally bumped into Middleton. The officer's dog, reacting instinctively, lunged at Gadsden. Middleton wasn't trying to sick the dog on the kid. The reality was quite the opposite. He was trying to push Gadsden away and hold the dog back at the same time. However, the camera captured a split-second moment that looked like something entirely different. Plus, in the tense atmosphere of the civil rights movement, people believed the worst. For Middleton, that photograph meant a lifetime of threats and hate mail. He kept his job, but the toll on his life and his family was immense. This was unfortunate because, as you'll see, there are people in the world who actually bring this wrath upon themselves. Number 6. A joke gone too far. Al Franken's fall from grace was nothing short of spectacular. In late 2017, the wave of sexual misconduct allegations sweeping through Hollywood and Washington, D.C., claimed its most unexpected victim. Franken, a former comedian turned U.S. senator, had been vocal about how women's allegations against powerful men were often dismissed. Then, out of nowhere, a broadcaster named Leanne Tweeden came forward with allegations against Franken himself. Along with her story, she shared a photo that would be the nail in Franken's political coffin. The photo, taken during a USO tour in the mid-2000s, showed Franken grinning as he pretended to grope Tweeden's breasts while she slept. It wasn't just the allegations that did him in. It was that damning image. No matter how much Franken tried to brush it off as a joke, the photo was simply too incriminating. As more women came forward with similar stories, Franken's career was over. He resigned from the Senate, his once promising political future in ruins. However, as far as misunderstandings go, the next one is the clear winner. Number 5. Blamed for an assassination. This picture will remind you of the summer of 1968. That year in June, one of the most inspiring figures in American society, Robert F. Kennedy, was assassinated. His death took a toll on the entire world, but one image from that fateful night can never be erased. It is a picture depicting the last moments in the life of Kennedy lying on the floor with his head in the hands of an unknown passerby. Today, anybody looking at this photograph is aware of Kennedy, but most will end up not seeing the young man holding him. That young man was Juan Romero, a Mexican-born 17-year-old busboy in the hotel where the unfortunate incident occurred. You may be asking yourself, what did he do to place himself in that photo at such a sensitive time? Well, it appears that Romero had only been holding Kennedy's hand when the senator was shot. One moment, this teenager was shaking the hand of a man he looked up to, and the next, He was in the heat of an assassination. This photograph was taken at that precise moment. Romero, who appeared to be both stunned and grief-stricken, supported the fallen Kennedy's head. The picture was also displayed on newspapers and television sets all around the world immediately after the assassination. For many, it was a powerful symbol of the tragedy of Kennedy's assassination, while others began to find things to blame. Unfortunately, some of that blame was placed firmly on Romero. Letters started arriving at the hotel where he worked, containing claims that the man had played some part in Kennedy's death simply because he had stopped to greet him. Some people even expected him to have taken the bullet himself, which was outrageous. Despite some messages of support, the overwhelming negativity took a toll on Romero. He wasn't prepared for the sudden and intense spotlight that was thrust upon him. As just a simple guy from the projects, he wanted nothing more than to go back to his normal life. However, that proved impossible. The weight of guilt and the relentless attention became too much to bear, and he found himself moving from place to place, trying to escape the infamy that followed him everywhere he went. Even as he grew older, settled down, and started a family, the scars of that night never fully healed. Romero never got the chance to go to college, something he'd hoped to do before his life was turned upside down. Although he eventually found some semblance of peace, the lingering guilt and unwanted fame stayed with him for the rest of his days. It's a story that reminds us that not everyone dreams of being famous, especially when that fame comes at such a steep personal cost. Then again, what could be worse than betraying your entire country with just one image? Number 4. Confused loyalties. Sometimes a photo doesn't just ruin a career or a reputation, it can put lives in danger. That's what happened to Sarah Iden, Miss Iraq 2017, who took what she thought was a harmless selfie with Miss Israel during the Miss Universe pageant. She posted the photo with a caption promoting peace and love, but the reaction was anything but peaceful. The photo sparked outrage across the Arab world, where relations with Israel are often tense, to say the least. Aidan was accused of betraying her country and turning her back on the Palestinian cause. The backlash was so severe that her family received death threats and had to flee Iraq. The government even pressured her to take down the photo and apologize. While Iden stood by her message of peace, her career as Miss Iraq was effectively over. She couldn't even renew her Iraqi ID, making it impossible for her to return home. This was a complex case of political conflicts, but what happens when people try to profit off of tragedies? Number 3. A strange commercialization. In the year 1995, the United States experienced the Oklahoma City bombing, which was considered an act of domestic terrorism that left 168 dead, including children. Amid the smoke, rubble, and ashes, a picture was taken that would come to symbolize the horror of that day. The photograph that circulated around the world depicts a firefighter embracing the dead body of a baby. However, the history of the photograph is as multifaceted as the feelings that the photograph causes. The man who took that photo was not a career journalist, nor was he a professional photographer. He was Lester LaRue, a gas company employee with his camera at the right place at the right time. He heard the explosion, picked up his camera, and ran to the scene, which he photographed for Newsweek. At first, LaRue believed that he had the rights to the photograph. After all, he was the one who took it. But problems arose when the mother of the infant protested against the commodification of her child's death. The matter got worse when LaRue's employer, the gas company, moved in to lay claim to the photograph, insisting that because LaRue was at work and had used the company's equipment, the photograph belonged to the company. After that, it was a legal war that LaRue was not ready to fight. The last thing that was left for LaRue was a pile of bills from his long and expensive legal battle with the gas company, a company that, unlike LaRue, had an almost infinite amount of money and a team of lawyers on its side. To make it worse, there was another photographer by the name of Charles Porter, who was almost at arm's length from LaRue as they both took the shot. Porter's photo went on to win the Pulitzer Prize, while LaRue's life was left in ruins. He faced the consequences of his actions, but some people have been facing their own consequences in secret, like the next person on this list. Number 2. Regrets that last forever. You've probably seen this photograph of a group of Marines hoisting the U.S. flag on the island of Iwo Jima during World War II. It is a picture that has been captured and put in history books, documentaries, and even in movies. Everybody thought that the men in that picture would be heroes for the rest of their lives, but the reality is not as simple as that. Though the photo grew to represent American bravery and people's endurance, the people in the picture who fought for their country also had their own struggles and hardships, which were not as glamorous as one might think. In the picture, you can see 6 men hoisting the flag, and out of those 6, 3 died in the ensuing heavy combat. They were taken off the field, flown back home, and paraded all over. They were shown off as heroes for morale back home in USA, but not everyone was ready to open the gates for this overnight stardom. For instance, Ira Hayes, one of the 3 Native American men who raised the flag, was one of the survivors. Hayes did not want to be famous or a poster child for the cause. All he wanted was to remain among his comrades and finish the battle as soon as possible. However, once the photograph was out in the open, it became almost impossible to cover up. Much to his dismay, Hayes was outed, and he had no option but to withdraw from the front lines to join the government's side. This unwanted fame was a burden to Hayes most of the time. For the rest of his life, people would seek him out for autographs or to hear his story. But instead of feeling pride, Hayes was consumed by the thought that he had abandoned his friends. This internal struggle eventually led him down a dark path, and he succumbed to alcoholism. His life cut tragically short. Lastly, we're now getting into a case that will leave you in complete disbelief. Number 1. A comedian's tragedy. Kathy Griffin is a comedian who learned the hard way that there are some lines you just can't cross. In 2017, she posed for a photo holding a fake severed head resembling then-President Donald Trump. She wanted to make a bold statement, but the reaction was far more intense than she ever expected. The image caused an uproar, and the backlash was swift and brutal. Griffin apologized, but the damage was already done. She lost gigs, was fired from her New Year's Eve hosting job on CNN, and found herself blacklisted in much of the entertainment industry. Griffin tried to fight back, even retracting her apology and claiming she was the victim of political persecution. However, her career was already in freefall, and she soon found herself performing in far-off places like Beirut, far from the limelight she once enjoyed. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.